everyone, and welcome to Getting to Know Hue, the Colour Teal. This month we are going to be working on block number 2, and we need 2 of them, and it is the Colour Teal. So you're going to need to grab colors 4, 5, and 6. So go ahead and grab those, and we will start doing the cutting. Now the first fabric we're going to cut up is fabric number 4, and fabric number 4 in your kit is a fat quarter. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a fat quarter really is, a fat quarter is a cut of fabric that quilters quite often use, and it is half a meter wide with half the width of the fabric. So if we are in Canada, since we are on the metric system, your fat quarter is going to measure roughly 20 inches by 21 inches. If it's an American fat quarter, because they are on the yardage system, the fat quarter will measure 18 by approximately 21 inches. So when we are cutting up this first piece of fabric, we want to cut it on the 21-inch width. So that would be perpendicular to the selvage. So here's your selvage right here. Okay, and we are going to cut it this way, perpendicular to the selvage, because this will be our 21-inch widthways this way. Where across here, since this is a Canadian fat quarter, it's only 20. And again, if it's American, it would be 18. So when we cut, we're going to cut this way, perpendicular to the selvage. So my first step is to get that little staple out of there that we put in so that I don't run over that with my rotary cutter, because that's not good for your rotary cutter. So we'll get that out of there. So now along that edge, I want to cut 2 3 3/4 inch strips. Normally I would say width of fabric, but in this case we are doing it width of fat quarter. Now once you've cut those 2 strips, you can put this away, this fabric here, for later use. And then we are going to take these 2 strips and we're going to subcut those into 3 3/4 inch squares. And we are going to want 8 3 3/4 inch squares. So go ahead, line that up. Let's get that selvage off of there. And cut 3 3/4 inch squares. So there's 2. There we go, and you can take this little piece, put it back in the bag. I like to label it 3 3/4 inch pieces so that I know for future reference. Put that back in the bag. We're done with that. Now we're not quite finished with these yet. We're going to subcut these on one diagonal. So make sure, as always, I'm going to get my smaller ruler because it's easier. Oop. When you're cutting anything on the diagonal, make sure you're right at the very, very tip to the very, very tip. And go ahead and cut. Now, do that to all of those 8 squares. And we are going to label these F triangles and stick those off to the side. Now we're ready to cut fabric number 5. And same thing, before I do any cutting, I'm going to take out that staple, because I do know I will hit that with my rotary cutter. And you just don't want to have that happen. There we go. Got that out of there. Now fabric 5 is also a fat quarter. So the same thing applies here. We want to cut this perpendicular to the selvage. So we are going to cut this way, right here. Okay. So first I'm going to just tidy up my edge here. And then we need to cut 2 1 7/8 inch strips. So I'm going to line that up. So I'm straight at 1 7/8. I'm going to cut 1. And I'm going to cut 2. And I know people don't like cutting 8ths, but in this case, this is not a block where we could cut it at 2 inches and then subcut it down later. When we trim it up, you want to make sure you actually do cut that at 1 7/8. Our next cut for best use of the fabric. If we cut a 3 3/8 inch strip, like so, again, that 1/8 is very important, so make sure you're on 3/8. Cut a 3 3/8 inch strip. You can then actually take that away. We can put it away. And then we need to do some subcutting. So grab that 3 3/8 inch strip that we just cut, and let's just get that salvage off of there. Now, from the 3 3/8 inch strip, what we're going to do is we're going to cut 2 3 3/8 inch squares. So just line that up on the 3 3/8 and cut 2 of those. There we go. Put them off to the side, and we are going to label them C. So those are our C squares. Put them off to the side. Now the rest of this strip that we just cut that was 3 3/8, grab it again, and now trim it down to 3 inches. So cut that extra little tiny bit off of there. That's garbage. And now subcut this into 4 3-inch squares. And then keep that little tiny piece. You just never know. You might have a use for it later. Now these 3-inch squares that we just cut, we're going to label them H, and we're going to put them off to the side. Now go back to your 1 7/8 inch strips that we originally cut. Same thing. I'm just going to again switch to my smaller ruler. Lay them down. And let's nip off that salvage. And now we are going to cut this into 8 3 3/8 inch rectangles. So again, line up on that 3 3/8, and we want 8 of them. There we go. Label those fabric number A and put them off to the side. Now the rest of this can go back in the bag. So now fabric 6 is not a fat quarter. So that's our next fabric. Grab fabric 6. And for best use of the fabric, I'm going to deviate just a little bit from the cutting that's in the book. So we're going to start by grabbing that fabric, and we're going to cut 1 4.5 inch times width of fabric strip. Now from that strip, I'm just going to remove the salvages. I've got that taken off, and we are going to cut 8 2.5 inch pieces from this. So 2.5 by 4.5, and we want 8 of them. So make sure when you're cutting them, you're lined up nice and straight. Oh, there, cut 8 of those, put them off to the side, and label them D rectangles. Now what we want to do is open that strip up, and we are going to cut 4 3-inch squares. So go ahead and cut 4 of those. And if you're more comfortable, just line it up on the 3 inches here, scoot all the way across, and then turn it, turn it there, and cut off the 3 inches. Like so, whichever way makes you the most comfortable. So either cut like that, let's just do it that way. Cut. And oh, I'm going to get that one a little pressed because it's got a little fold in there. There we go. And then I will just turn around, subcut those to 3 inches. So I'm going to take those 3-inch squares and I am going to label them H, put them off to the side. Now I'm going to take the leftovers of this fabric and I'm going to cut that into 1 7/8 inch strips. And I want 2 of them. So let's find my nice straightest edge. Line that up on the 1 7/8. So I'm lining it up here on the 1 7/8. And I'm going to cut. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing. Line that up on the 1 7/8. And I'm going to cut. Now I'm going to take these 1 7/8 inch strips and I'm going to cut them into 1 7/8 inch squares, and I want 8 of them. So I'll start just by making sure that I have an even edge over here because I've lined the strips on top of one another. Nip off that, and now cut some 1 7/8 inch squares. There's 2. 4. 6. And 8. Okay, so we can label those fabric number B, put them off to the side, and this little bit that's left over, that can just go back in your bag. Now, all that cutting was done from one full width of fabric 4.5 inch strip, and it was better use of the fabric than cutting it up into a fat quarter first and then doing the other cutting. Now, from fabric number 27, you're going to grab 4 of your 13-inch frames and 4 of your 16-inch frames. Put them up there. And then, from the yardage that's left over, we are going to cut 1 full width of fabric strip 3 inches. So go ahead and cut 1 full width of fabric 3-inch strip, and then we're going to subcut that up. And what we are going to do with this one is we are going to cut 8 3-inch squares. So just line your ruler up there. Get rid of that salvage. And we want to cut 8 3-inch squares. Now I did have a couple of 3-inch squares left over from a previous block, so we can just add those into the pile. If not, cut a full 8 3-inch squares. Take those, label them H, put them off to the side. Now the rest of this 3-inch strip, we want to turn around and subcut that into 2.5 inches. So make sure it's all lined up nice on top of itself like this. And, oh, we need our bigger ruler for this one. We are going to recut this into a 2.5 inch wide strip. There we go. And now we're going to cut this into 8 2.5 inch squares. There we go. Take the 2.5 inch squares, label them E, and put them off to the side. This can go back in your bag. Maybe we'll use that another month. Now, we also need to cut 2 5 1/4 inch squares, but we just need 2 of them. so we don't want to cut a hole with the fabric strip. So you could just go ahead from the one edge and open it up so it's just single layer, like that. Make sure it's not coming up underneath so you end up cutting 2 layers when you don't want to. Okay, line your ruler up on the 5 1/4. And what we want 2 of these squares. So we need to have at least 10.5 inches. So I've still got the selvage on here. So I'm going to take that to a little over 11 inches, and that'll give me enough room to trim off what I don't want. So I'm lining it up 5 1/4. I'm going to go ahead and cut, and then I'm going to cut across here. There we go, and then that fabric can go away. And now I'm left with a little short 5 1/4 inch strip, and I am going to subcut that into 2 5 1/4 inch squares. Now we're doing it this way because this is the only time in the whole entire quilt now that we use the 5 1/4 inch square. So just go ahead and nip that off. There we go. Now again, this is a little wrinkly, so I'm going to just go give it a quick press. That's better, a little straighter. Now what I want to do is I want to cut this on both diagonals. So line your ruler up. And again, I don't like to cut this too many layers deep. In fact, a single layer is probably your best bet. Line it up so that you're right at the tippy tip, right at the tip there. Do your cut, and then if at all possible, without moving the fabric, just bring your ruler around to the other side and cut your 5 1/4 inch. And do that with both squares. So you'll end up with 8 of these triangles, and we are going to call them triangle G. And then that's all the cutting done. We are ready to start assembling this block. So now we're ready to start putting the block together. And our first step, we want to grab our A rectangles. Those are out of fabric number 5, 1 7/8 by 3 3/8 rectangles. We want to grab our 1 7/8 inch squares, which are squares B from fabric number 6. We want to grab the 2 3 3/8 inch squares that we had labeled C, and they are made from fabric number 5. And what we're going to do with these is we are going to make a funky little 9 patch. So you want to put the 1 7/8 inch squares like that. We're going to take an A, put another one over here, put another one here, and one there, and one there. So this is kind of just a funky little 9 patch that we're making. And we're going to make 2 of them, of course. So you're going to lay them out. You're going to sew this row together, and this row together. So what I will usually do is just before I go to the sewing machine is I'm going to lay this out how I want it sewn. Like this. And I'm going to sew down these sides, down these sides, down these sides. Then I'm going to hit the ironing board, and then we'll come back and we'll sew the rest of that block together. So you're going to make 2 sets of this. So off to the sewing machine. And near I am, back from the ironing board, and I just pressed these seams whichever way they wanted to go, and they seem to like going towards the out. Press this way. We don't have to worry about matching these seams up with anything, so we're not as concerned about which way they go, so just let them go whichever way they want. So you now take this part, put it off to the side, and we're ready to do the next step. So grab your 8 3-inch squares of background, and make sure, it's a little hard sometimes to tell on the white one, make sure you have the wrong side looking up, and you're going to draw a diagonal line on the backs of every single one of these squares. Using whatever marking pen works for you. If you've got the darker backgrounds, you might have to use a white marking pen. The lighter backgrounds, a friction will probably work just fine. And draw a line on the back of each of those. Now make sure you're going right from the tip to the tip with the line. You don't want to be off. And then what you're going to do, once you have these lines all drawn, now we're going to take all of these and lay them right sides together with right sides together with 4 of fabric 5 and 4 of fabric 6 3-inch squares. So you'll end up with 8 of these all together. And when I do these, I was going to say I'm missing one, but I'm not. There it is. When I do these, I like to actually sew a scant 1/4 inch on this side of the line and a scant 1/4 inch on this side of the line. That way, when I cut them, it gives me the opportunity to be able to square them up to the correct size. So draw your lines, go to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch or a scant 1/4 inch if you want to square them up from this side of the line, and a scant or a full 1/4 inch from this side of the line. And then what we're going to do is we're going to cut them directly on top of this line. So pair all those up and then off to the sewing machine. Okay, back from the sewing machine. Now go ahead and cut all of these on top of the line that you drew. And then off to the ironing board and press them all towards the dark. So that is our next step. And you can cut these with your scissors or with a rotary cutter, whatever you want to cut them with. There we are, back from the ironing board. Now if you did scant up your 1/4 inch, you want these half square triangles to end up being 2.5 inches. So give them a quick check and make sure that they're at 2.5 inches. And if you need to square them up, then this is how you'll go about doing that. So when we're squaring up a half square triangle, you can't just, or you shouldn't just go ahead, line the ruler up on 2.5 and cut everything off. You really need to do both sides. So what I do is I grab my ruler that has a diagonal that goes right to the corner, right here, and I line the ruler up on that diagonal, and I make sure that I'm past 2.5 inches all the way around. And then I'll cut that off. Then I can flip this around, do the same thing, line it up so that I'm exactly on the diagonal right here, and then I am also perfectly on the 2.5 on the square, and then I can cut that off. And that will give me a perfect 2.5 inch half square triangle. So I'm just going to go ahead and square up all of these, and then we can move on to the next step. Okay, I've got them all trimmed up. Off they can go to the side for now. So our next step is to grab our D rectangles, and we want to grab the 2.5 inch squares of our background, lay them down right sides together like this, and then draw a line from top left to bottom right. And you're going to do that to all 8 of the 2.5 by 4.5 rectangles. And then what we're going to do is we are going to go to the sewing machine, and we are going to sew directly on top of the line this time. We don't want to sew to either side of it. We want to sew directly on top of that line. And make sure that when you're putting them down, all of the squares go from the top left to the bottom right. Okay, so that's it. Next step, lay those down, mark them, off to the sewing machine. Okay, now here I am back from the sewing machine. So if you chain piece, just cut them all apart. And then what we're going to do is we actually want to trim this off, but we want to make sure that we're 1/4 inch away from the line. Don't cut it right on the line, that would be bad. So line up your 1/4 inch on the line that you have sewn and trim that off. This is garbage. And then over to the ironing board and then press this towards the dark. So we want to press it away from the lighter fabric, or even for those of you doing the dark fabric, press this towards the D rectangle. Okay, so that's your next step. Give all of these a trim. Make sure you're cutting 1/4 inch away from the line. and then back to the ironing board. And now we have all our components ready to make the next block. So you want to take the darker teal half square triangles with the dark pointing up towards the left, and the lighter one you want to put it pointing towards the right, and then that unit is going to go right in there. So we're going to sew those two together and then sew them to one of these units. Like that, and we're going to do that 8 times. So that's your next step. Sew these together and then sew those together. Now when you're sewing these together, if you did the pressing as was suggested, then when you sew these together, you will have lovely opposing seams right there. Right? That makes that a lot easier to sew together. And then when you sew this unit together, you will also have opposing seams. So it makes it a lot easier to put this block together with those opposing seams. So carry on. There we go. Back from the ironing board. Now when you put this block together, you should have about 1/4 of an inch from this point to the edge and from this point to the edge. And that will be taken up in future seam allowance. So we are ready for our next step. So for the next step, take all of your F triangles and we are going to lay them down here. Now on this side right here, and when you're laying the triangle on, you should have equal sticky outie at the top and the bottom, and the point should be lined up right with that seam that you had previously sewn. So we're going to go ahead and sew. We're going to sew this on all 8 of our units, and then press that, and we will then sew one down here also on all 8 of the units. So we're going to end up with something that looks like that. So next step, off to the sewing machine, sew all 8 of these, press, and then we'll come back and we'll sew the other triangle on. And here we are back from the ironing board. Now when I pressed these, the seam allowance wanted to go towards the triangle, and I just let it. There was no point in fighting with it. Now our next step is to take the other triangle, lay it up here. So when you're laying this down, you should have equal sticky outie, and the point should be lined up with this seam right here. So now go ahead and sew this triangle on to all 8 of your units. There we go. Back from the ironing board. So now we are ready to start sewing our rows together. And this block is going to go together on point. So grab one of your center pieces, and we're going to take our end pieces that we just completed, like so. And then we want to put the last of the triangles into the block. So here's what you're going to do. Oh, make sure they're right side up. You're going to sew these 3 pieces together, and when you sew that triangle on, make sure that the raw edges here are all lined up, and the raw edges here are all lined up, and you're going to sew 1/4 of an inch here, 1/4 of an inch down here. Give that a press. These ones, you're going to sew this together and that together, and then you're going to repeat this process for this one down here. So this one, making sure that your raw edges are lined up, and sew this one, making sure your raw edges are lined up. So those are our next steps. So those 3 pieces together, these 3 pieces together, these 3 pieces together, then we'll hit the ironing board, and we will finish off the rest of the assembly. And here we are back from the ironing board. Now I pressed these seam allowances in, these ones out, and these ones in. I mostly pressed them in because of the light color. I didn't want to see the darker color through. I don't know if that will matter so much on the gray or the charcoal, because you won't be able to see that color leaking through. It was a bit of a chore to get them pressed this way, and this way, but it worked. So now we're going to take this one, lay it over here, sew that on. This one, lay it over here, sew that on. So we want to line up, make sure that these seams here line up, these seams here line up, sew those together, and then we are ready to put our borders on. There we are, another very pretty block. Okay, now we are ready to add our borders. So take 2 of the 13-inch borders, put one on either side of the block, top and bottom, on both of your blocks. Take that to the ironing board, press it, and then we'll put our 16-inch ones on the other side. So back to the sewing machine. And there we are, back from the ironing board. Now I pressed the seam allowances towards the border. That was just the natural way that it wanted to go. And lastly, let's take 2 of our 16s, and we're going to put a 16 on each of the opposite sides of the block. Sew those on, give them a press, and then we're ready to trim. There we are. I've just given these a little press, and now we are ready to square them up to 15 1/4 inches. If you have a 15.5 inch ruler, you can square this up to 15 1/4 just by laying it down and making sure that you're the same distance from here to here. But I don't have a 15 1/4 or 15.5 inch ruler. I have a 15-inch ruler. So back to that math like we did last month. My block is measuring 12 inches square. So this is the center of my block, and I'm going to take 12 divided by 2, and then I want to take the 15 1/4, divide that by 2, and that gives me 7.625, which is 7 5/8. I'm going to take the 7.625, subtract my 6 inches, and that means that leaves me with 1.625 inches. So to get my 15 1/4 inch square, what I need to do is line the seam line right here up on 1 5/8 inch, like so. So I have my seam allowance here, 1 5/8 inches, all the way down, a little high there, and I can just cut that off. And then I'm going to spin the block, and I'm going to do the same thing. Line it up 1 5/8 inches, all the way down. Oop. 1 5/8, 1 5/8. So I'm just visually lining the block up all the way down 1 5/8. Cutting that off. Same thing. So go all the way around your block and cut it down to your particular number. And then we are done for another month. There we go. That is another done block. So there we have Getting to Know Hue, the Colour Teal. Getting to Know Hue, the Colour Teal. Thank you very much for joining me. And next month, we will be doing the color Magenta. So everyone have an absolutely wonderful month. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Happy sewing!